To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland, whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass, pull up a chair, and we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross-Time Pub amidst the likes of archaeologists, art enthusiasts, and the occasional anomalist. I'm Micah Hanks, Jason Pintrail in the house, and James Waldo sitting over there and slurping what appears to be a Guinness tonight.
Yeah, I've got Guinness 200th anniversary edition, actually.
Oh, man, I tell you, there's nothing in the world finer than Guinness to me. Quick anecdote, fellas. My good friend Jeremy London was here in the Land of the Sky visiting recently, and I didn't know that our good friend Justin Biltonen was also in town. Justin, of course, is a pretty well-known musician. He plays bass for the group Three Doors Down, and we grew up together, and he's a wonderful fella. And so we kind of had this wonderful surprise gathering, and we started in a coffee shop, but eventually I said, come on, we got to go and have a Guinness, fellas. Well, Justin said, I'm kind of really in the workout mode lately. I've been exercising a lot, so I'm not drinking a lot of beer, but I'll sit and join you guys while you have one. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, yeah, right. So you know how this goes. He sits down, he's joining us, and Justin says, I could have one Guinness. I get a text message from him last night with a picture of him holding the Guinness. He says, you've got me hooked.
Never disappoints.
Well, it really is just so wonderful. And one of those misconceptions people have about it is, it's so heavy, though. It's like drinking a loaf of bread. And I'm like, actually, it's not. Guinness has a lower alcohol content. It's a little over 4%. It's got fewer calories. It's got a higher antioxidant content. And that wonderful creamy head, which is rich in calcium, I will tell you something, folks, and call it a home remedy if you want, but if you ever have heartburn, I have tried everything from actual over-the-counter medications to the old school apple cider vinegar and honey remedies and things like that, baking soda. Nothing in the world will cure heartburn like Guinness. And I really do think it has something to do with the calcium capacity in the beverage. So it's one more reason why, in my personal opinion, it will always remain on tap here in the Cross-Time Pub.
Brilliant.
Tasty.
Well, it's been a big help to me this week. It is potty training week here at the Pintrail house. And so my son is about 3 months from being 2 years old. So we went ahead and started on this process, and he's actually doing really well. We've been really surprised. He's picked it up pretty quick. We turned it into a game. So therefore he's having fun with it, and he's so proud of himself. So that's a process. Guinness helps with that. That's for sure. But in addition to that, it's also Old MacDonald week. So we've had that classic kids song repeated over and over and over. So if you guys don't remember, the old chorus is E-I-E-I-O, which I have heard about 3,000 times this week.
And you'll never forget it, even if you already knew it, even if you wanted to forget it.
Yeah, those are good times. Both of my kids are grown. I have a daughter that's 26. She lives around the Little Rock area, and my son is 19. He'll be 20 this year, and he's in the Navy and is in Japan right now. And then I have a stepdaughter, and she lives in San Antonio. But it never really gets easier. So the challenge with the kids just evolves to different things. When they're newborns, you have the newborn things that you have to do. They stay up all night, and you have to feed them, and then they transition to now it's potty training, and then soon it'll be elementary school, and they've got the elementary school things you have to worry about, and just school in general, grades and behavior and all of those things. It just the intensity level never drops off. it just shifts around, man. It's a good time. Just enjoy yourself, because before you know it, you'll be out of the house and you'll just be, sitting around recording a podcast and drinking beer. It's a terrible life.
Well, I'm going to mark this episode in the archives so that decades from now, I can get in touch with both of you guys' children and remind them that their dads talked about potty training them on their podcast, and then they're going to take that and they're going to blackmail you and say, I can't believe you did this, and now I want that sports car, et cetera, et cetera. So you guys have already stepped in it. Oh, boy. And, we're going to be seeing a little later in the program other things that people a long time ago stepped in, which include giant sloth footprints. More on that a little later. I do want to also mention really quickly that I celebrated my 35th birthday recently. And I have to mention that here because, as you guys know, and I've already told you, one of the nicest gifts that I not only received this year, but ever came from my cohort and accomplice, Mr. Jason Pintrail here. He got me a copy of the book co-authored by Don Ham, The Birth of a Culture, which is a book that is really, I don't like that expression, coffee table book, but if I use that, people know exactly what I mean. This book is so much more than that, though. This is an articulate, beautiful, colorful representation of the life in collecting of Don Ham and what we're able to extrapolate, the data that we glean from the collection, and the way that it can be related to certain cultural representations in parts of Middle and Eastern Tennessee. And I've got to, first of all, thank you, Jason. Second of all, commend you, because not only is it a wonderful gift for an archaeology enthusiast, but he sends it to me, and I open it up, and there's the inscription from Don Ham, who mentions Jason and signs and dates it. What a beautiful book. It couldn't get any more beautiful. And then there's Don Ham's inscription inside of it. And that was so special to me because we got to meet Don when we were down there together, the team in Greenville, North Carolina at the archaeology show where Don was. Jason, you may have met him before, and I know that you certainly had corresponded with him before that, but that we got to go and stand and talk with him together and look at that particular little item, the pendant from his collection, where you see the grimacing man who's dead and the vulture with its beak touching his chin. And this is something that is represented in a lot of different iconic expressions from different Native American cultures throughout history and across the United States. And he took that out of his case, this priceless relic, and he hands it to Jason and I, lets us hold it, turn it in our hands, look at it. I think Jason put a picture of that up on our Instagram, of probably a picture I took of him holding it. And there's that very thing that we have held in our hands and studied and just been in complete awe of, front and center on the cover of the book. Oh my God. That arguably is one of the finest birthday gifts I've ever gotten. I just wanted to thank you right here in front of everybody in the Crosstown Pub. That was wonderful, buddy.
Well, you're most welcome, of course. And, you only turned 35 once. So, again, happy birthday to your brother. It's the least we could do. We wanted you to have a good one and make it memorable. And, that is a fantastic book. Don is a most gracious person, just a fantastic spirit, and someone who has been doing this longer than just about anyone. And he has so much knowledge, so much compassion, and just a wonderful guy. So, I appreciate the fact that he made the book and that he made, that incredible collection that he has available to share with other people. And, he's always been a steward of this hobby, and someone that we consider to be a friend here at Seven Ages, and hopefully get a chance to talk with him some more in the near future. So,
guys, we have been so blessed. And James, I know you got a rant that you got to get out of your system. And, and you've been such a good boy. He's been better than a boy being potty trained, sitting over there, being quiet. For James Waldo to be quiet for this long, I don't know what to think. But again, we have been so blessed in our journeys, in our travels, in our adventures, the people that we've been able to meet, interact with, speak with, the knowledge we have learned. And, every time we talk, there's just a little more, a little peppering, a little sprinkling, the accumulation over time. And this is just a wonderful journey underway. That's why we call it an audio journal, folks. You're right here in the field with us. Okay, James, what's on your mind?
Okay, so I've been sitting on this story for probably a good month. We were talking earlier about, how we see sometimes these coordinated articles that seem to come from different directions about a certain topic, especially at the national level. Science is often politicized for different reasons.
Sure.
So there's been a few stories about Scott Pruitt, who's the director of the EPA, and now he wants to change how the EPA operates. And for a very long time, the way the EPA has operated about things is they have not disclosed the data from a lot of the studies they use to implement policies and regulations. And I've never been a big fan of that because I think that's bad, you know, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in just a second. But there's a story, and it's in basically environmental news. It's NE News is the name of it. And it says, Pruitt is expected to restrict science. Here's what it means. Now, this article is kind of an example of a hit piece on this, and it's kind of a scaremongering thing. Oh, the EPA won't be able to do its job and that type of thing. And really, that's not the case at all. And EPA hasn't come out and said exactly what the plan is going to be, what this is going to look like. But basically, and then I'm going to read from the article here. Basically, what it says the initiative is expected to require EPA, when issuing rules, to rely only on scientific studies where the underlying data are made public. So there's no problem there. If you're going to make rules or policy, the taxpayer who paid for these things should be able to see the underlying data. Sometimes you're going to get some friction from groups that lobby against that or whatever. However, if you don't have a good, transparent process, really in anything, but especially in science, which is, you know, the thing that I'm most concerned with here, it breeds mistrust between the public and the government. But the other thing it does, and a lot of people don't understand this or don't, it's not that they couldn't understand it, they're not in a position where they would think about it, is for those of us that are in government, and I don't work in a regulatory capacity, I just work within the framework, but you get a sense, it's possible to get a sense of, we don't owe you anything. We regulate from our ivory tower, and the proles don't need to know what the data is. You just have to trust us to have your best interest in heart. And we all know that that's probably not a good position to put either the public or the government in, because it leads just all of those bad things that I was talking about. So this is going to be undone at the EPA, which is, you know, people that understand these things are actually applauding this. Now, some of the people at the EPA are not very happy about it, because that means that it's going to make their jobs harder, but it's good. You know, and there's been a lot of rules and a lot of policy that's been passed, and I'm not going to single anything out, but some of the stuff was just not very well done, and it was not good policy. And a lot of it was things that have to do with energy, or let's just say general environmental things. I know a lot of people say that they're going to destroy the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. That can't be further from the truth. And the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act are actually two very good pieces of legislation that they get expanded upon as time goes by. Because sometimes there's new contaminants that are discovered. They call them emerging contaminants, and sometimes they turn out to be, you know, worse than we think, and sometimes not quite as bad as we think. There's a one that's coming out now that's there's more research coming out. It's called PFOS and PFOA, and this is an additive that's in plastics. Well, let me just be blunt here. It's in everything. Everything. They don't know how harmful it is. It's widespread. We've had some presentations on it that I've sat in professionally recently in the last year or so. It's so prevalent in almost everything that we use. They had to basically rewrite sampling techniques, and there's all kinds of materials that can't be used for sample collection. So normally, like if you used a pump that was going to draw water out of a well, you use silicone tubing. Can't use silicone tubing because it's in silicone. You can't use a glass jar with a Teflon lined lid, which is kind of the standard for a lot of stuff, because the Teflon has this contaminant in it. So those are things that are coming out. But that data, if any policy is made or any regulations are made about this stuff, which it will happen, this stuff needs to be made public. So there's a public comment period. You should be able to look at the data. All the other government agencies do that as far as science goes. Like Corps of Engineers, if we're going to make a rule, all the data is public. And there's a 30-day public comment period on it. And, and those things are taken seriously. So anyway, that's it in my rant. I could talk about that all day. But don't let people trick you into thinking that the EPA is better off hiding data from the public and making policy on it, because that's really not the case.
Really quickly, let me just add that, again, this isn't a partisan issue by any means. It relates to the issue of secrecy and the release of information that is important to the public. It's one thing if you have a legitimate national security concern. which is something that is withheld from the public in the interest of the public, and for various reasons that perhaps protect that information from becoming something that is accessible to enemies of the United States or the free world in general. I mean, I understand all that, and so don't mistake this for being a partisan issue. I mean, this really, to me, comes down to if there is data that is attainable and if it is not of national security interest and therefore qualifies for being kept secret, why isn't this information, this data, made publicly available? And I think that the American people not only have a right to know, but that they want to know, especially we who have an interest in science. And so I understand what you're saying right there, James, and I appreciate that because it's so important to be able to understand that from a regulatory perspective and also from the perspective of freedom of speech, expression, association, all these things, and a right, I think, frankly, fundamentally as individuals to know what our government's doing and what information may be of importance and relevance to us. We do need to know these things. And that doesn't just apply to science, but again, people who look at science like the three of us, it's all the more important to us. And I hope that people can see that in the proper context, historically, socially, culturally, and otherwise. What we do really need right now is transparency on these issues as we move forward together as Team Civilization.
One of the issues pertaining directly to this, talking about the release of data, is one of the arguments was that oftentimes there is so much data pertaining to a particular topic that it's nearly impossible to post all of that for public review. Because it could be years and years and years worth of data built up over testing, and it goes on and on and on. I mean, sometimes it's incredible amounts of data that would have to be looked over, dealt with. So, I know that was one of the issues and concerns that was, we can't literally put up that much data for everyone to review was one of the concerns that I had heard.
Well, and sometimes that is true, but that's not always the case. And a lot of times the studies are paid for by the American people. And sometimes it's just maybe one or two studies. And yes, certainly there are cases where you can't replicate this or you can't replicate that, or it's just like so much data, we can't put it all out there. The point is it just needs to be available. If they ask for it, or if it's on a website. I mean, that's how we used to do business. We had great regulations. I mean, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act are two fantastic pieces of legislation. That is really what the EPA was created for, was to administer those two things. And they did a great job. The EPA was fantastic back in the 70s. The people that wrote some of the regulations and some of the things that have been written that I've been involved with in the past, it became apparent to me that some of those were very, very wise people. They foresaw how industry would operate within these regulations. And some of these things were written in such a way that it would fulfill the environmental requirement without burdening industry or the public with too much expense in a process of having to deal with something. I don't know that that's happening now.
Well, what's interesting is that I think as we see this conversation evolve over the next few minutes, we're going to be continuing to look at the interesting corollaries between industry, environment, and what role humans play in all this, especially as it relates to predation and hunting in the ancient world. But before we get to all that, Jason, I want to come back around to you because I know that I've been excited about this segment for weeks now, having known that it was going to be on the table. I'm not even going to mention what it is. I'm just going to let you take it away.
Well, we started this show off talking about children and all the things that you go through as a parent and the different stages that children go through. And one thing that I'm seeing a lot more of today is children at a younger age coming home from college or even high school with a fresh new tattoo. And it's something that's really, caught on in the last even decade. I myself have 4 tattoos, the first of which I got when I was 18 years old. Probably not the best idea at that time. Of the 4 that I have, I would say that I could probably do without at least 3 of them. But, the idea behind tattoos is that they represent a certain part of your life in a way that you felt at a certain time. They could have been worse, but I guess I got lucky in the fact that I didn't get too carried away when I was 18 years old, that is. And I would also say that the artwork and the quality of the artwork has gotten exponentially better over the last 10 to 15 years. And some of the art that we're seeing today is absolutely phenomenal. But, looking at that has a generational thing. For instance, the generation that my mom comes from, they kind of saw tattoos as, only meant for those people who are, biker gangs and tough guys, and, only a certain type of person had that. And really, that's not a new interpretation of tattoos. What I'm referring to is in the spring 2018 issue of American Archaeology, which is a publication of the Archaeological Conservancy. They have a very interesting article written by Gail Keck called "Discovering the Archaeology of Tattooing." And I just want to read the first paragraph here. It's very brief, but it kind of gives some insight into how what I just described with my own mother's interpretation of tattoos, how that can be applied to the world of archaeology. So let me just read this here, and this is directly from the article. So, quote, "In old Western movies, Indians were invariably depicted galloping into the scene, whooping and streaking with war paint. At least one aspect of that cliche is true. Native Americans did decorate their bodies with temporary pigments, but you might be surprised to learn that they practiced a more permanent and deeply meaningful way of adorning their bodies, tattooing. Equally surprising is the fact that this important aspect of Native American culture was largely neglected by archaeologists." So we get into that and we say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean it was largely neglected? And they go on to say, well, the reasons are complex. Some of these reasons that they give are cultural. According to Christian Gates St. Pierre, who's an archaeologist at the University of Montreal, people wearing tattoos were perceived as marginal. It may have looked like a non-serious topic for academics. So therefore, tattoos kind of got that same attachment, if you will, that I described earlier. They were often frowned upon by religious groups and became casualties of a larger effort to erase that part of the Native American culture. According to Aaron Dieter Wolf of Tennessee Division of Archaeology and Washington University anthropologist Carol Diaz Granados, this meant that tattoo imagery wasn't granted the same cultural value as images on pottery, shells, stone, and other media. So to kick off this conversation, I think that's very interesting that not only was, in an earlier generation from my mom, who was born in 1947, kind of had that attitude about tattooing, but we see that sort of same thing being applied to the archaeology of tattooing as well. So what we see here is a long tradition, not only in Polynesian cultures, which has a little bit more fame for the art of tattooing, but this was a long-standing issue. I mean, actually, if we look back to even, you guys remember Otzi the Iceman, right?
Right.
He was found in glacial melt in the Austrian and Italian border. Well, he actually had 61 tattoos, and he's about 5,300 years old. It's often believed that his tattoos were indicative of a medical treatment, almost like an acupuncture type of approach. But yeah, he actually had 61 tattoos. There was a recent article talking about tattoos found on the Egyptian mummies. I think it was March of this year. We saw two 5,000-year-old mummies come forth. One had a bull and a Barbary sheep tattooed. A female had a sort of S-shaped motif on her upper arm. And then when we refer back to the Native American practice of tattooing, we see that Native Americans used highly structured events that accompanied profound changes in their social and spiritual status. So we see the tattoos being used as, a representation of nature, of spirituality, of tribes and different things like that. According to this particular article, it actually says there's even a 1706 record of the Iroquois braves drawing their facial tattoos in a trading post account book as their signature. So, the tattoos that they had on their face were actually representative of what we consider to be a signature. That's how they would sign into the logbook. So, a fascinating narrative.
That reminds me peripherally of a recent book, and I haven't had time to look at the book or assess the content. So this could just be somebody's theory. And theories are fine. It's just, if you're going to have a good theory, you also need to have some scientific substructure that supports that. But the concept was that different petroglyphs found on stones throughout North America showed so much consistency that perhaps they were indicative of trading posts or something like that, and that the symbols actually were meaningful to the trading that was occurring at those locations. And so that's what that reminded me of, because when you talk about the idea of a symbol on a person's face or body as represented in a tattoo being tantamount to their signature in the ancient world, this just goes to show that in early language and perhaps also in pre-language cultures, the role of symbol and what that plays, and that outward expression of an inner concept or of a sense of self that extends beyond what we are born to resemble, if that makes sense. And that, to me, is so fascinating. It's again why I'm fascinated with Carl Jung. I'm fascinated with a lot of different symbological studies and things that have occurred over the years and throughout time and by different people. But I mean, that is such an intimate part of who we are as people. And to realize its importance in the ancient world and the new layers that are being uncovered is all the more important, I think, to understanding the way of the ancient mind.
Undreamed of layers of complexity in the archaeological record that are kind of coming forward. As far as tattoos go, I've never been a tattoo guy. How about you, Micah?
No, I don't actually have a single tattoo. And being a guy who has played guitar in bands for years, I'm actually surprised how many of my friends who I consider to be a lot more, I guess, conservative in their lifestyle than I am, have tattoos, and yet I don't. But it's just never been something, body piercings, tattoos, and any kind of body modification, really. I've never been drawn to that.
Yeah, me either. In all those years I spent in the military, it's very, very common in the military now. Of course, I guess I sort of came from maybe that in-between generation of like old school and then the kind of the newer generation. But I mean, when I was growing up, like nobody had tattoos. It was like, sailors, hookers, and bikers or whatever, people had tattoos. But later on, they were very common. And even when I was, right after I got in the military, when I was like 18, 19 years old, there was lots of guys and they'd get these big, ornate dragons and all, stuff that was popular in those days, but just never appealed to me for some reason.
Well, again, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing an increase is really directly related to the ability of the artists now. I mean, like I said earlier, some of these artists are absolutely phenomenal. And they can do things, on the human canvas that you could never even imagine 30, 40, 50 years ago with the equipment, and everything that's came along with that. It's all really top notch these days. But looking back to these indigenous people, according to this article, the indigenous people of North America practiced 3 main distinct tattooing methods. So this included hand poking with sharp implements. They would dip it in a pigment solution. Sometimes it would be charcoal or other types of red ochre, things like that. In another way, incisions with flint or obsidian quartz blades would be made, and then they would rub it into those incisions, followed by pressing the pigment directly into the wound, as what we see with Otzi the Iceman. And as far as the hand poking goes, that's still done in traditional Polynesian culture and in many places across the world. In fact, that's became quite a big business where people will actually go to be tattooed in the traditional style by one of those artists or by a shaman or medicine man or something like that. And again, what we're seeing now is so many people do memorial tattoos for a loved one that they've lost. I've seen people with tattoos for their pet that's, they've lost, all types of different things. And I really don't think it was probably that much different, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago for some of these folks. They were going through this and taking the time to do these tattoos because it meant something to them in some way, shape, or form, whether it was spiritual, whether it was a tribal thing, or whether it was just something that they had overcame in their personal life. It had some sort of meaning to them. And I think it's fascinating. And now we're starting to actually find these bone implements that for the applicators that they would use, the quartz blades and different things, archaeological speaking, that says, yes, this is an important part of these people's culture and it's something that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely does need to be addressed. I'm so glad you brought this to the table on this episode, and all the more reason I was so excited to hear about this. Again, I think, James, you'd agree, you don't have to have tattoos to understand what a cultural staple they have become, but it's not a new phenomenon by any means, and it's something that's been with humanity for a very long time. In fact, there are a lot of consistencies that I think that we see between the relationship between humans and the earth going back to ancient times. And in the next segment, something I think that we want to spend a little time talking about is not only the relationship between megafaunal species and ancient humans, which were actually modern humans, but also what role the humans played in their environment, and possibly also the decline of those megafaunal species. More in a moment. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Overkill or overblown? That is the question. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal, and this has been a question, I think, on our minds and a lot of people's minds in archaeological circles for quite some time, because there is a hypothesis. Jason, I'll let you do your due diligence and the honors for the occasion. What is the overkill hypothesis?
This is the idea that the earliest people of North America basically killed off all of the megafaunal creatures and species that we saw here. So, everything from mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, short-faced bears, saber-toothed tigers, all of these things would have been essentially killed off by prehistoric man using the world-famous Clovis points. They would have swept down from the Beringian passageway and just wreaked havoc across the United States, killing everything in sight. So basically, there's different ways you can break it down. There's different ways of looking at that. But more appropriately, over the years, that overkill hypothesis is sort of slumped off. It's not been accepted nearly as widely as it used to be as we began to look at things like climate change and other interactions that we may have had that could have caused this large-scale extinction event that we saw happen in North America.
Yeah, and again, that references the Younger Dryas, where we do seem to see a sharp decline, not only in megafaunal species, but also in the modern humans that existed on the North American continent at that time, i.e. what would have been the Clovis culture. Now, interestingly, with and I can say at this point, numerous interactions with archaeologists and historians, the consensus among the academics we have spoken to is that they find it far less likely that humans hunting megafaunal species led to their mass die-offs. The latest scientific evidence is making that case. And again, obviously the verdict is still out on that, but there are some who want to say that it was more as a result of climate changes and environmental issues, and that in the case of the Younger Dryas, that is either a natural process as it results from Earth leaving a glacial period and the melt runoff into the oceans, and of course the disruption of thermohaline circulation. For those who don't know what that is, of course we're just talking about the circulation of ocean currents as it results from temperature variances. And cool ice water melting and running off into the ocean is going to have quite an effect on an otherwise fairly warm body of water. So these kinds of things could have disrupted the environment in the ancient world, not just at sea but on land also, and could have actually modified global temperatures on a mass scale for a period until a general regulation occurred. So that's one theory of what this Younger Dryas event, this cataclysmic model for climate change in an abrupt sense that occurred 12,900 years ago. That's one idea of, as far as what happened. The other contending idea is the idea that something like a meteor or a comet might have struck the Earth and triggered those kind of changes, and our exit from the Ice Age in general. But looking at the human predation angle, the latest science is in. I want to read briefly from a USA Today article, and then we'll look at some other stories that are talking about similar relevant information. This is the story of a man and a sloth, a very large sloth, and a man who followed that sloth. And what the story, thousands and thousands of years later, seems to be. There's still room for interpretation. USA Today reports, although it sounds like a grade B science fiction movie, fossils show that our ancestors once hunted and fought giant ground sloths. For the first time, according to the article, scientists have uncovered fossilized footprints of ancient humans at the White Sands National Monument in New Mexico, a new study reports. And at the same time, those newly discovered human footprints were actually found within footprints of giant ground sloths, tall, fearsome creatures with sharp claws. And admittedly, there is a rather ridiculous image to accompany this article, which is based on art by Alex McClellan of Bournemouth University, but you see the sloth standing there. I had to do a double take and understand what I was looking at. Scientists say this is evidence that the humans followed closely behind or even stalked the sloths during the hunt. I have a quote here from David Bustos, park naturalist who discovered the trackway 10 years ago. He said, "The White Sands Trackway, a series of tracks and footprints, shows that someone followed a sloth, purposely stepping in their tracks as they did so." And they feel that what this is indicative of is the story of the stalking of a giant sloth that was killed by ancient people. Study co-author Matthew Bennett of Bournemouth University in the United Kingdom said it's a big discovery to have humans there, and they include a photograph, and you can clearly see what appears to be the rounded heel of a human foot placed within what is presumed to be a giant sloth's footprint. Paw print, track, spoor. What would you call that? I guess you'd call it a track, right? They had claw. Well, actually, the article here says, they say, now extinct, the giant sloth would have been a fierce foe for our ancestors, with its tight muscles and front legs tipped with Wolverine-like claws. A single sloth could tear apart any human hunter if approached directly. So unlike the tree sloths that we know for their rather sedate activity, the giant ground sloth is probably not the kind of thing that you want to reckon with. And this is definitely something that ancient people did, which seems to point to the idea, according to this study, that some dangerous megafaunal species were hunted out and killed by early humans. Of course, they're going to kill anything in their environment that they can live off of. The question has been one of, does the evidence that we have of, for instance, bison jumps, of mammoth butchering, of sloth stalking, and other varieties of megafaunal killing, does that constitute evidence that humans and their predation activities led to the extinction of, or significantly impacted populations, at very least, of megafaunal species? But now this is what's interesting. NPR now also reporting on a new study, and this reported just on April 19th, that ancient humans hunted big mammals to extinction. We do have audio.
Mammals came into their own after the dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago. Felisa Smith, a paleobiologist at the University of New Mexico, says a lot of them got really big.
We had llamas and camels and sloths and certainly mammoths, and then lots of really cool predators like Archaeology, the short-faced bear.
And that was just North America. Being big was a pretty good thing for a mammal anywhere.
Taken as a whole over 65 million years, being large did not increase mammals' extinction risk, but it did when humans were involved.
Looking through the fossil record, Smith found that when humans evolved, the rate of extinction for big mammals rose. She says it came down to hunger.
Certainly humans exploit large game, probably because they're tasty.
And also because a bigger animal makes for a bigger meal. But humans did other things besides hunting that hastened the disappearance of big mammals. They burned forests and grasslands that big mammals used. They competed with the big carnivores for game. Over time, the downsizing of mammals affected the environment in ways you might not imagine, say in the erosion of the land.
When a large animal walks up a hill, it zigzags a lot, whereas a small animal walks up more directly. And that has an impact because water follows those game trails down, and so erosion and vegetation and whatnot are affected by that.
Smith's research appears in the journal Science. She found this phenomena to be true for at least the last 125,000 years. Fellow paleobiologist Rebecca Terry at Oregon State University says the new research shows that human influence on mammal size started in Africa, where humans first evolved.
And eventually the spread of modern humans, Homo sapiens, into the New World. And at that point, pretty advanced weaponry was definitely present, and the extinctions in the New World in North America and South America were really extreme as a result.
Yes, we still have lots of furry little mammals, but consider this. 11,000 years ago, the average mass of a non-human mammal in North America was about 200 pounds. It's now about 15 pounds, and the researchers say they're getting even smaller.
You know, one of the issues I have, though, with this NPR story is that in the actual article, they have an image from 1870, and it shows very modern-looking humans. And yeah, I know we're talking about biologically similar human beings from those which exist around the globe today. But, I mean, these look like they could be, you know, beachgoers down there in San Francisco someplace. And, of course, it's all the brawny males brandishing clubs and crude axes and things and fighting off this short-faced bear. And I don't want to make light of it, but, I mean, again, this is something that Dr. Jim Adavasio talked about during his lecture that we attended up at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. This kind of a stereotype of this is what the ancient world was like, and this is how men were out there just beating megafauna to death with clubs and spears and things like this. And you've got the woman cowering off in the entrance to the cave. With all the sensitivity to gender politics and things like this that we have these days, I'm kind of surprised that NPR would include this sort of an image in their article, seriously. Because, as Adavasio and many others who have actually studied archaeology of things like basketry, net making, and things like this, we have an awful lot of preconceptions and stereotypes about what the roles were in terms of things apart from gender. I mean, you know, in terms of hunting, gathering, child rearing, we have a lot of preconceptions about what those roles were in the ancient world and how people interacted with their environment. So there's this very stereotypical kind of an image right here, front and center in the NPR article, which is almost laughable by today's standards, and yet this is the 1870 illustration showing prehistoric men using wooden clubs and stone axes to fend off attacks from a large cave bear. Yeah, but then again, this, I guess, is conducive to the existing narrative that thanks to this sort of interaction, these larger animal species in the ancient world were definitely affected, as was the environment in general. They note, of course, although they're not being bludgeoned with clubs or anything, they note in the caption, mammoths can be seen in the background. Well, yeah. But again, we absolutely know that in the ancient world, and going all the way back to Clovis, that's part of the great discovery at the Clovis type site, the site which is named for, or rather for which the culture is named. It was near Clovis, New Mexico, and hence that's what we call a type site. The Clovis culture near Clovis, New Mexico, what we have is we have what James Ridgely Whiteman had originally discovered and called warheads, those very large, broad, grooved or fluted lithics that are associated with the Clovis hunting. And yeah, I mean, they found extinct megafaunal species there, represented in the geological strata. They were mammoths. The implication there, and also a couple of thousand years later at Folsom, New Mexico, is that there were large megafaunal species being hunted by people. I guess the question remains, to what extent, especially with the new studies coming forward here, to what extent were their existence affected by the presence of humans in the ancient world? And was it indeed human predation, or was it environmental factors, or maybe a combination of the two that led to megafaunal extinctions? But again, you know, one question I've always had, and I guess maybe I'm trying to espouse a bit of skepticism here, larger animal species throughout history, when environmental changes occur, are the first to go. We saw it with the dinosaurs also. If it were just humans hunting animals, we would have to take into consideration things like, well, what happened to white-tailed deer? You know, why have certain other species thrived? And generally the smaller species also. I guess there are a lot of questions. But again, there seems to be a pretty clear correlation between the size of the animal and their susceptibility to environmental changes. And yes, that humans did play some role in that. And also one more, guys, real quick before I open it for conversation. But, you know, here's an article, too, from newhistorian.com talking about a feces-eating fungus, which further shows that humans sent megafauna into extinction. And some of the article discusses this. They say a team used a sediment core. This team, again, both from Australia and also from Boulder, Colorado at the university. I've been to the University of Colorado at Boulder campus, in fact. They've got a very large, magnificent scale model of the solar system there. But they said that, again, that they have used this joint study used ancient feces left behind by megafauna to reach the conclusion that indeed humans impacted the lives of megafauna. And they said that they used sediment cores drilled from the Indian Ocean off the southwest coast of Australia to reconstruct past climate and ecosystems on the continent. The sediment core contains chronological layers of material blown into the ocean, including ash, dust, pollen, and spores from a fungus known as Sporomalia, which thrived on the dung of plant-eating mammals. And ladies and gents, let me just tell you, and this is no joke, when you're spending a lot of time out there on dig sites with archaeologists who talk an awful lot about things in the ancient world, the discussion of sporomelia comes up an awful lot, does it not?
It absolutely does.
It really does. This is a frequent discussion we have. Analysis, according to this study, of the sediment revealed that spores from the sporomelia were in abundance from 150,000 years ago until plummeting around 45,000 years ago. And this is what Professor Gifford Miller of the University of Boulder's Department of Geological Sciences says. The abundance of these spores is good evidence for a lot of large animals on the southwestern Australian landscape up until 45,000 years ago. Then, in a window of time lasting just a few thousand years, the megafauna population collapsed. And so they do think that the arrival of humans probably did contribute fairly significantly to this. What do you guys think?
Well, there's so many facets to this conversation. Again, when we're talking North America, specifically with the Clovis people, there is a tendency to look at the Clovis as exclusively big game hunters. And, that's due to the fact that there have been Clovis points associated with many different kill sites, especially out west in the western states and even down into Mexico. But, to me, I can't envision these people just being an exclusive anything. When you're in that environment, I think you would be an opportunistic hunter. You would probably take anything you could find, forage, whether it's vegetation, whether it's small game. Again, we're only looking at large kill sites, and we're looking at the presence of Clovis points being found and butchering tools found at those particular kill sites. Again, we do not have a record because these things do not last. Perishable things such as traps, nets, different things like that could have been used for small game. We don't have that representation from the Clovis people. So we really don't have an accurate portrayal of how they were hunting, what were their foraging habits, what were they eating. We can't test those stomach contents because we don't have the bodies to test. If you remember back down in Titusville, Florida, at the Wendover Bog site, that near perfect preservation in that peat bog, it allowed scientists to actually see stomach contents, and we saw things like fish bones and elderberry seeds and things like that, and we could get a much clearer vision of how these people were eating, what they were eating, and maybe even why they were eating it. So a lot of that vital information is missing from specifically the Clovis people. Now, again, the overkill hypothesis is, there's more to it than they just, swept across and killed everything. A lot of people have presented the idea that they took out the top of the food chain, therefore the rest of the food chain kind of collapsed beneath it. And that makes sense, to a certain degree. However, I've just never envisioned what I call the Clovis killing machine as being powerful enough to sweep across the entire North American continent and disrupt that food chain to such a degree in such a short period of time as to be responsible solely for the megafaunal extinctions. What I think is happening there is, and this is just my opinion, is it's a multitude of factors that are happening. Yes, they may have been disrupting that food chain to some degree, but there was a climate issue. There was a loss of habitat. There was a loss of vegetation. We know that certain things were happening in the environment at that time, with the climate at that time. And I think what we're seeing, at least as far as the North American extinction goes, is a multitude of factors that led to the megafaunal extinctions, not just overkill.
And some of these articles, they seem like they're working a little extra hard to sort of, sell the overkill hypothesis. And on the sloth article, there's no evidence there of anything other than a human footprint within a sloth footprint. We don't know what happened there. I mean, it's as easy to believe for me that they were just, they might have been just harassing the sloth because the thing moved so slow. It was probably just good entertainment, or who knows what they were doing, but no evidence they were stalking or killing sloths or anything.
Yeah, I do have a quote from Felissa Smith, who led this study. And again, she would be somebody who would be fascinating to talk to. And I maybe would move that would try and contact her at some point. But, one of the quotes from the article here is, taken as a whole over 65 million years, being large did not increase animals extinction risk, but it did when humans were involved. And I do like the fact that some of these studies, look at areas like Australia, where you do see that there was an earlier shift in the environment, whereas we can look at that 12,900 year boundary here in North America, and it's almost up for grabs. Was this more environmental? Was this the fact that there were people coming into this continent within a couple of thousand to 3,000 years prior to this event, and they're dispersing, and they are, again, spreading and procreating and hunting because there are more mouths to feed as population increases? These are all important questions, but the logical question that must be asked is that what we saw around the 12,900 year boundary in North America and thereafter, and as we see population incline in North America, is there a proportional increase in humans or rather, is there a proportional increase in humans and a decrease in megafaunal species? And can we look at other parts of the world prior to migrations into North America where there was an existing human presence, and did they have a similar effect on megafaunal species in those regions of the world? That's a very important question. And I think that, again, taking geography into consideration, we can't just look at any single certain small area of the globe. We have to kind of look at this en masse and look at the broader relationships around the world and throughout time between humans and the megafaunal species in order to fully understand the relationship that they had with each other and perhaps the detrimental relationship humans had on those large animals.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one point I was going to make is one place where humans have existed with megafauna really since the dawn of human beings is Africa. And Africa, megafauna still exists. Elephants, you have lions and tigers and all types of large animals, and they've coexisted there for, from time immemorial. So if humans were basically the only factor, then you would think if everything else was equal, they probably would have wiped out all the megafauna species there long ago. But those animals still exist. So in my mind, I think probably was the combination of factors, but probably mostly the environmental factors around the 12,900 year mark.
Well, it seems almost inescapable that there is a combination of factors at play there. And like you say, the prevalence of megafaunal species in certain regions of the world today, we have to look at environment. And we have to ask ourselves questions about how did the environment affect that, and how was it more or less conducive in different situations to the survival of these species. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, those are all excellent points. And again, James, throwing it back to Africa, I mean, really anything considered, I think megafaunal is anything above 100 pounds, right? So, I mean, we still have megafaunal species in North America as well. So, I mean, it's to me, having studied the Clovis people, having studied their technology, their lithic technology and all of that, while it is impressive, I just don't see enough of it out there being found, and the presence of these people across the entire North American continent. Yeah, they did exist from coast to coast, but I don't see the amount of lithic recoveries and everything that you would expect to see a absolute overkill hypothesis actually be able to come to fruition.
Yeah.
But then again, I'll repeat my opinion.
There's so many mysteries, so many things that still need to be answered as far as the questions we have about the past. I'll tell you, somebody who really had not just the past, but biology in mind, and really all areas of the sciences, was a fellow who we're going to look at in this next segment. We're going to remember on this special edition of the program the late William R. Corliss, American physicist and purveyor of the anomalous. But he wasn't somebody who was just pandering mystery. This was a man who, by virtue of his scientific discipline, I think was uniquely disposed to look at scientific data and to try and spot the very kinds of things that we're talking about. These are not mysteries for mystery's sake. I think these are breadcrumbs marking the path home, in a way. More on that when we return here in a moment on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. William R. Corliss. He's a name well known to some, although if I could have it my way, more would know of the work and the legacy of this individual. He was a Navy veteran, having served during World War II, and as a physicist, he was director of advanced programs in the nuclear division at Martin's in the 1960s. Now later, he became a prolific writer. He authored 57 books on atomic energy, space propulsion, scientific satellites, teleoperators, wind tunnels, and of course, I think really what we want to focus on today, his interest in scientific anomalies in all fields of science. Corliss was somebody who, to me, he didn't want to smack in the face of science and say, you don't know what you think you know. What he wanted to try and do was highlight the excluded minutiae. And he wanted to try and emphasize the things in science that are unusual, but which are often overlooked. And there's plenty to be found in that regard. I was able to actually find a paper that he had written, and this titled A Search for Anomalies, and I'll just briefly quote him here. He said, "Since 1965, I've been culling systematically from the literature of science those observations that challenge reigning paradigms. The tangible result of the thousands of hours spent in libraries has been a series of source books, handbooks, and catalogs that at present are in the possession of James Waldo and Jason Pintrill." No, I digress. But I mean, it is true. We all own a lot of Corliss's books. And he himself inspired by the earlier works of a rather notorious figure in American history, Mr. Charles Fort. Now, Charles Fort, of course, was the guy who gave light to the term Fortean, and many consider Forteana, therefore, the antithesis of science. And in many cases it actually was, which is why it's so important what William R. Corliss did, because, and I'll quote not from Corliss himself, but from Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke talking about William Corliss, he, in his book Astounding Days, a science fictional autobiography, Clarke wrote that William R. Corliss was Fort's latter-day and much more scientific successor. And that's the importance. While someone like Charles Hoy Fort, back in the early part of the 1900s, was attempting to try and offer a dialogue that was in contrast to prevailing scientific belief, I don't think that Corliss was trying to do that so much. He followed in Fort's footsteps in finding the anomalies, but he used scientific source material to support his arguments at every turn. So returning to what he had to say in this article here, he says, some of these anomalies are truly profound and have important implications for science, such as the quantization of astronomical redshifts. Others are less significant, as in the recent discovery of that curious little door in one of the Great Pyramid's air shafts. Overall, this immense accumulation of anomalies will hopefully encourage new research projects, some paradigm shifting, perhaps even the emergence of yet undreamed of hypotheses that will better describe nature. Well, he goes on to talk about an awful lot of things here, but I think that really encapsulates it all. He saw the little minutiae in nature, the anomalistic elements, as being keys to a greater understanding of the broader phenomena that we seek to try and understand in nature. And again, I want to kind of quote from Adrian Hope, this article which appeared in New Scientist, July 14th, 1977. In science, there is, in the public record, a wealth of hard fact reported firsthand, but consistently overlooked for the simple reason that it fails to fit neatly into any scientific pigeonhole and thus remains unclassified. Sometimes this unclassified residuum of hard scientific fact can have direct bearing on modern scientific puzzles. For example, the recent reports in the popular press of complaints from people living in London, Bournemouth, Cardiff, Blackpool, Glasgow, and Ipswich of mysterious humming noises, which are supposedly baffling scientists, bear a marked resemblance to those of sounds heard a century ago in iron steamers off the coast of Greytown, USA. They said in the U.S., William Corliss of Glen Arm, Maryland, has embarked on the mammoth task, not megafaunal mammoths, by the way, of classifying 200 years of backlog of previously neglected but potentially interesting scientific material. A nuclear physicist who has worked for NASA, Corliss has 6 years of source books available, each containing classified and meticulously cross-indexed references and excerpts from old and new papers and magazines. They go on to note that some of these are extremely obscure, others not so much, but there's a point that I think I really want to just emphasize here before I turn it over to you guys, and we talk about some of our very favorite things that Corliss covered in his source book projects and over the years. turned his attention toward. But there's a segment in the article from New Scientist titled Healthy Skepticism. Reassuringly, the annotations are healthily skeptical, where the waifs are in serious doubt. For instance, alongside that hard fact report on radio disturbances over the ocean is an excerpt from an 1847 report of the British Association describing how 2 Liverpool residents in the Great Park at Birkenhead saw in the clouds an erect image of Edinburgh for a period of 40 minutes. Corliss reminds the source book reader that the straight-line distance between Edinburgh and Liverpool is about 170 miles, and that as there was at that time a panoramic model of Edinburgh on display in the Zoological Gardens at Liverpool, quote, the coincidence of the mirage and the exhibition is hard to swallow, unquote. Corliss is even more skeptical when quoting in his Strange Artifacts, a report from the English Mechanic of 1892, where he cites as a source a certain Archdeacon Norray, who it seems climbed the top of Mount Ararat and there discovered Noah's Ark, which he, quote, walked round with 5 or 6 companions. The Ark, like a UFO, notes Corliss, is found frequently. Corliss, he absolutely was skeptical. He was also known by those who loved him in life, no less among them his wife, as being a man who had a profound sense of humor. And these are things that I think, in a lot of ways, are missing from modern scientific inquiry. People don't have a sense of humor. They resort to ad hominem and vitriol before they allow themselves to laugh at their own mistakes. And I think that even those who call themselves skeptical are often so entrenched in dogmatic ideals and values that they fall short of true skepticism, which Corliss never seemed to lose. And he was very picky about the subjects that he covered, but nonetheless, he would always give credence to an idea, if not giving himself to it. And that's what was so fascinating about him. He was a true scientist in the sense of science, and somebody who, sadly, I don't think is well regarded enough and widely enough for the work that he did. It's almost incomparable in terms of people who have contributed to science in the last century, and that's why I'm so thrilled that we're talking about him tonight on the podcast.
Pretty good intro, Micah. That's it's going to be hard to follow up. But what I have in my hand here is a copy of Anomalies in Geology, which is physical, chemical, biological. It's written by William R. Corliss and published first in 1989. And I wanted to read from the preface, the first paragraph on the preface page, because he basically sums up why he does what he does and why he looks for scientific anomalies. So I'm just going to read this, a few lines, and then we'll go from there. After more than 16 years of scouring the scientific and semi-scientific literature for anomalies, my major conclusion is that this is an amazingly fruitful activity. In fact, organized science should have been doing the same searching and compiling for the past 200 years. It is simply astounding that a catalog of anomalies does not already exist to guide scientific thinking and research. It is at least as important to realize what is not known as it is to recognize the well-explained. End quote.
Corliss, mic drop. Jason, I know you've got a similar introduction from one of the source books. And by the way, which was your copy that you're reading from there, Jason?
This is coming from Science Frontiers, Volume 2. This is More Anomalies and Curiosities of Nature, and this was published in 2004. And, as you're listening to this, we want to make sure that you understand we're not just reading off a bunch of quotes here. We're wanting to give you insight into the mind of William R. Corliss and kind of why he was doing what he was doing, because it is very important. And these guides and catalogs that he was creating, they serve a legitimate purpose, and they're encyclopedic in their volume. And if nothing else, they are guides for deeper thinking. And they certainly aid me in research, because there's so many different things that are represented. But to kind of, again, give you some insight to how he thinks and how he basically assembles these catalogs and books, I'll read from this book here. It says, quote, I believe my eclectic, hopefully objective survey, relying almost exclusively upon the major science journals and magazines such as Nature and Science, will impress the most jaded skeptic that anomalies of scientific value are ubiquitous in the natural world. The pages of this book and the predecessor may seem overly iconoclastic, sometimes verging on pseudoscience, but the history of science tells us that the future students of the cosmos will laugh at today's conservatism and lack of vision. William R. Corliss, September 1st, 2004.
Again, what you have there is an individual who is willing to acknowledge that some of his own interests and personal scientific pursuits may be deemed by the more skeptical to be pseudoscientific. And one might make the argument that if approached from any given perspective, almost any subject or even scientific discipline might be relegated to pseudoscience. And that is true, and one must guard themselves against that kind of a thing. But full knowledge of that in hand, Corliss proceeded and looked at times at what might be deemed fringe otherwise, and also with that historical concept in mind that, we have been proven wrong so many times in the past, we should at very least, while maintaining that skepticism ever present, we should keep an open mind. And that was truly, I think, the resounding message of Corliss. But again, his humor kind of fed into that. I've got something really special for us tonight, by the way. William R. Corliss, I've got a lot of friends, people who have worked in, every walk of American life, who have been interested in science, and many of us over the years in our correspondences have shared dialogue about the work of Corliss. And it's often lamented the fact that there is virtually nothing in the way of audio interviews with him or anything like that. And to my knowledge, no audio of him speaking even existed. At least that was my thought until today. And today I found something in preparation for this program that is truly novel. William Corliss, in 1997, was giving a lecture. And this probably was in Baltimore, Maryland. He was giving a lecture at an event that many years since and years following his own passing from this mortal realm, I actually gave a lecture there myself in Baltimore. And Corliss had a very unique appreciation for birds. His interest in the biological mysteries of avian species is something that he devoted entire volumes of his biological source books to. And this lecture that we're about to hear a little audio from, Biological Anomalies in Birds, says it all. But again, what we're really hearing here is not so much what he had to say about birds. There's a good hour and 18 minutes worth. We don't have time to get to that right now. What's more important is the fact that this sentinel, as he was in the sciences, was the silent sentinel. And many have often bemoaned the fact that there was not enough in the way of audio that actually documented his thoughts. And when I found this video, I was absolutely gobsmacked. And we have a little audio right now of the late William Corliss discussing in 1997 biological anomalies in birds.
When I started preparing this talk for 14th about birds, I thought I would go back to Charles Fort's collected books, 4 volumes, and try and find out what he wrote about birds. I went to the index and all I could find was something birds, falls. That's all. I thought to myself, well, we have bird falls today. For example, the latest one I have in my collection happened in 1991.
One can tell that the audio isn't great. The quality is quite poor. I was nonetheless just fascinated to be able to hear and to see Corliss standing there at a podium talking. And, maybe, ladies and gents, we're geeking out quite a bit here, but again, I don't think I can emphasize greatly enough the single-mindedness of this individual. Most people are an expert in their field of science, Most people are, they're really good at one thing or another. This guy, Jason, you have a word for people like Corliss and their ability to assimilate and systematize and to synthesize information from a wide area of different disciplines.
Yeah, and that word I use is generalist. And, it's not that flashy, it's not that big of a word, but it's extremely important. It's important to science. It's important to archaeology and anthropology. And really, what we're seeing is a good, solid generalist who has, knowledge of mathematics, who has knowledge of different sciences, whether it be geology, biology, whatever it is. If one person can have a bunch of little pieces of the puzzle, sometimes it aids in seeing the whole picture more clearly. These days, we have people who specialize in one thing and one thing only, and that's all they're able to see. It's almost sometimes as if they have tunnel vision. So not to degrade that, that's an important thing, and we need people who have dedicated their lives to one particular subject and truly are experts on that. And that is by no means, speaking down about those people or demeaning that, because so many years of study go into that one particular topic, and it is indeed very important. But a generalist who has a working knowledge of many different disciplines can sometimes look at a problem, an issue, a mystery, and have just enough information from all these different disciplines to have a more full picture of what they're seeing right in front of them. So I think William R. Corliss was one of those people who had not only a grounding in science, but had this thirst for knowledge and that type of mind that would not allow him to be pigeonholed into one thing and one thing only. If you go out, I encourage you to at least purchase one of his books. They're very reasonable, and just flip through it, or if you have access at a library or something like that, and just look at the amount of topics that are covered in just one volume, and he has a multitude of volumes. So, this book that I just read from, Science Frontiers, Volume 2, Chapter 1, Archaeology, Chapter 2, Astronomy, Chapter 3, Biology, Geophysics, Psychology, Chemistry, Physics, Math, and then Esoterica in Chapter 7. Okay, so we see this wide range of interests, of knowledge, all of which can talk to one another, if you will, and appreciate one another. So, just in the archaeology chapter alone, you have ancient engineering works, small artifacts, art, diffusion, culture, all of those things under just the chapter of archaeology. So when I say generalist, to me, that is someone who just has that wide array, who has a good working knowledge of many different scientific disciplines and many different things in general. It doesn't even have to be science, but you've talked to those people and you're like, man, those people know something about everything. And I feel like William R. Corliss was a great representation of that type of person who has that hungry mind, who just wants to learn more, partake in more. And I think we should be grateful, honestly, that he put all of these books together, because, like I said, while some of the material is dated, while some of it has been proven to be not exactly accurate years later, just because the science has moved forward, if nothing else, it is a good starting place for anyone who's interested in a multitude of subjects like I just described.
Yeah, and since, there's sort of a prevalence of interest in archaeology on this program, now that we've given you an idea of who Corliss was and what he did, I want to go down a list of Corliss's own, and this is his compilation, not mine, his most noteworthy archaeological anomalies. And some of these may be far less anomalous by today's standards, but keeping in mind that he, wrote about a lot of these in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, some remain true. They are anomalous and they're interesting. And these are, again, in archaeological circles. The first one he lists, the pit bands of the Andes. These pits are about 1 meter deep and arranged regularly in bands around, or about 24 meters wide. The bands run along the ridges in that region for miles. The second one he lists is the stone meanders and labyrinths of the western United States, which, and there's very little else said about that. I'm interested in what this is. And these, by the way, come from a particular source. I have the article that I mentioned earlier that was titled by him, A Search for Anomalies, and that's where he lists in various disciplines his interests. But the stone meanders and labyrinths of the western United States, I'd like to know exactly what those are. Number 3, he lists here boulders with triangular holes called Viking mooring stones. There are hundreds that have been found in the northeastern United States. Number 4, he lists are hundreds of large precision-crafted stone spheres in Costa Rica. I've seen photographs of these, in fact. He said they are near-perfect spheres made of hard granite. The East Bay and Point Rey Wall of California, builders and purpose unknown. He says Incan stone masonry. Number 6, interlocking precision-fitted multi-ton stones, some with many quarters. We have number 7, ancient Baalbek's massive dressed monolith in Lebanon, which weighs approximately 1,100 pounds. Oh, I'm sorry, 1,100 tons. We have number 8, the enigmatic stone blocks at Tiwanaku, and at least one Inca site. These are huge, geometrically complex, fashioned out of hard rock and seem to have no discernible purpose. Moving over across the pond to Scotland, number 9, Scotland's ancient vitrified stone forts. How did they melt granite? I'm so glad that he mentions that. That's a favorite of mine, too, and it could be any number of things, but what melted the granite in the stone forts? Vitrification, for those who don't know, again, is basically essentially where stone is heated to a point where it flows together almost like glass, and you find fused stone walls. These have not only been found in Scotland at these forts that he mentions, they've been found at places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in modern-day Pakistan, a lot of different places. In modern times, of course, we associate it with vitrified sand fused together at places like Alamogordo following nuclear tests. It's not to say that there were nuclear weapons used in ancient times by any means, but it is interesting. One must ask, what kind of heat source would have vitrified stone in ancient Neolithic forts in Scotland? Fascinating stuff. And the list goes on, but I do want to just kind of maybe conclude with number 10 here. Enigmatic structures within the Great Pyramid. And these have long held the fascination of people, and Corliss was among them. Examples he gives are the so-called air passage with a secret door, sand-filled cavites, layered granite beams in the king's chamber, and the mysterious sliding plugs and several more really perplexing structures. Lots of different things like this. It's just fascinating stuff. And again, one has to have an appreciation for the anomalistic character of any discipline, not just archaeology, although I've thoroughly enjoyed his contributions to archaeology in the volumes that I own.
You know, one of the things that I always think is entertaining about his books are the things that were anomalies at the time that the book was printed that have since been solved by science. In the Book of Geological Anomalies here, it's broken down into 3 categories: biological, chemical, and physical. So, and one of the things that he touches on, and it's always kind of a big thing, in especially in geology, is mass extinctions, or also biological explosions, where where there's a great diversity of species in the fossil record, basically, essentially overnight. So, and the introduction part for the phenomena of anomalous biological processes, he says the geological record is full of biological phenomena that cannot be explained easily using prevailing theories. So he goes on and covers a lot of different possible processes that could cause mass extinctions and these biological explosions. And these are all theories from the scientific literature. But anyway, I'm gonna skip to the end here, and he kind of compiles a few things. He's got a list of causes, and he calls this is surely incomplete, but many of the situations and events listed below are obviously interrelated, and these are all things that could lead to mass extinction. So the first one is disease, followed by climate changes, including temperature changes, greenhouse effect, etc., interspecies competition and predation. I guess you could include mankind in that. Let's see, parasites, environmental poisoning, including acid rain, changes atmospheric composition, cosmic radiation, sea level changes, ocean composition, overcrowding, magnetic reversals, lunar volcanic eruptions, comet, asteroid, meteorite impacts, volcanism, tsunamis, and finally, constipation.
And that's a good one to have on there, yeah.
So where I'm going with this, though, what I mentioned about things that have been solved is the mass extinction that occurred at the KT boundary. So in the physical anomalies section of this, he talks about shocked mineral grains at geologic boundaries. So the description says mechanically shocked grains of quartz, feldspar, and other minerals occurring in strata located at major transition points in geologic history, in particular the Cretaceous Tertiary or KT boundary. The shock grains are usually found in conjunction with iridium spikes and other possible evidence of catastrophism. Now, you hear us talk about this on this program fairly often about proxy data or proxy indicators for impacts. That's what a proxy is: shock quartz, iridium spikes, and that kind of thing. So, at the time that this book was written, there were several locations in North America and around the world where this had been found at the KT boundary. So there was Brownie Butte, Montana, Raton Basin, New Mexico, Casal Basin, Austria, Teapot Dome, Wyoming. There's a place in Spain and several other places. So, but they didn't know what the smoking gun was. They didn't know where the crater was. They thought that the thinking at the time, the smoking gun could have been in Iowa. It's called the Manson structure in Iowa. It's under the city of Manson, Iowa. But we know now that the culprit for the KT boundary is the Chicxulub crater off the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that was found later on through scientific research. Scientists out in the field finding these things, and they just happen to come across it. So all these other locations that are listed in this book and were listed in the literature at the time, nobody knew exactly where it came from. One of the things that let me skip back to the extinction thing. The big battle between, especially for the KT boundary, the big battle in science then, was it volcanism or was it some other mechanism? Eventually, the catastrophists for the extraterrestrial impact won out because that's where the data led. Now, there's always some people that sort of hung on to that. But in the end, after reading the proxy data and then finding the smoking gun crater, the Chicxulub crater, everybody essentially said, yeah, okay, that's pretty much it. So where I'm going with this is sort of where we are with the Younger Dryas boundary. We've got proxy data. We've got two camps of people that are kind of arguing back and forth what the possible cause is. But as far as anybody knows, we don't really have a good smoking gun impact crater. We can say, yep, that's definitely the one right there. Or do we have it?
Maybe that'll change in the next few months or years. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? So, but that's the interesting thing about that, because you can look back and see that the way science, you can look today and see the same things going on in the scientific community that went on 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's the same arguments. It's the same egos, the same personality types. Some things just never change.
It is kind of cyclical, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
What goes around comes around, they say, but that really seems to be the case with a lot of these kind of things, where you continually see the old ideas mirroring the new arguments. When are we going to learn, huh? When are we going to get wise to it?
Never.
I think Corliss, that's exactly what he was saying. He was saying, I mean, if you look at the history of science, how many times have we been proven wrong? And how often did what appeared at one time to be an abstract or an unlikely theory come around to be the one that was most scientifically plausible? Now, granted, you need good evidence, physical data that supports something. You don't give yourself to things for the sake of belief alone. But again, the popularity of a theory does not necessarily make it the most scientifically plausible. Nor, and I'm afraid in our modern culture, and with all due respect to my friends who are social justice warriors, to use that term, and not in the weaponized sense, I think that a lot of people who are inclined towards social justice and who are very given to the issues of race, ethnicity, cultural class, all these kind of things, very important and preeminent issues that they are, sometimes their attitudes toward those issues can blind the way that they interpret data. And although it's a noble blindness, it is a blindness nonetheless. If we're to look at science and we're to take from science what the data shows, we cannot be blind to physical evidence and that which is demonstrable in a laboratory setting, and which is repeatable and which is irrefutable. And that's what science seeks to attain, so that we can build upon a data set which is, without question, the truest form of truth that we have at our disposal. And yes, ideology and culture can affect that. And again, noble though that attitude is among many modern academicians, I'm afraid that we give ourselves so much to the emotion of the cultural issues and the social dilemmas that sometimes we are blinded to the reality of the science underlying all these things. And at what point you have to ask, do you wish to be, true to yourself? At what point can you rid yourself of dogma, bias, and ideology and say, I'm willing to accept what is true?
Got to be like Spock, man.
Well, yeah.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah, but logic is not always a comfortable thing.
It's not. There's comfort in consensus, consensus agreements on things, but, I don't know that that's not necessarily a good place to find the truth always.
The truth can be a burden at times, depending on how you look at it and from what ideological perspective or other perspective you may find it. I think that when you shed your expectations, your ideologies, your dogmas, and your biases, that truth that you find at the end of the day, it may not always be comfortable, but there is a comfort in knowing that you have rid yourself of the impediments to that ultimate truth. I think that William R. Corliss did that in admirable ways. And that's why it's been so enjoyable to talk about him, his life, his work, and his great insight on this edition of the Seven Ages Audio Journal. I want to thank you, both of you, my colleagues and comrades, Jason Pintrail and James Waldo. Would one of you please do your finest in pouring me another beverage, because I think we're well overdue, and it's about time for us to wind things up. Good evening to you, gentlemen.
And good evening to you. Glass is empty, and it is time to head out.
Indeed. So until the next time that we all gather together here, pull up our stools, pour up our glasses, and open our minds, I bid you adieu, my friends. Jason Pintrail, James Waldo, and Micah Hanks. It is the Seven Ages Audio Journal.